Picture this. You wake before sunrise, in a small room with no window, on a straw mat that smells faintly of the men who slept on it before you. You do not know what day it is. You do not need to. Every day is the same day. Somewhere above you, in the warm part of the house, a family is still sleeping. A family that owns you the way they own their furniture, their dishes, their dog. You are not a person under the law. You are a thing, a talking tool one Roman writer will later call men like you. And today, like every day, your value is measured in exactly one way: what you can be made to do before the sun goes down. Now picture something stranger. That same evening, once a year, the house turns upside down. Your master pours your wine. Your master serves you food. For one single day, you are allowed to say anything you like to the people who own you, and they cannot punish you for it. Rome called this Saturnalia, and for one day, the most rigid social machine the ancient world ever built simply stopped. Why? Why would a civilization built on the total ownership of human beings carve out a single day where the chains seemed to loosen, only to lock tighter the very next morning? To answer that, we have to go back, not to the festival, not to the famous rebellion you've probably already heard about. We have to go back to the moment a person stopped being a person, the auction block, the chain, the first breath taken as property instead of as a human being. Because the story of Roman slavery isn't really about ancient history at all. It's about how an entire civilization convinced itself that some human beings simply weren't human beings, and what it took every single day to keep that lie alive. This is what it was like to be property in the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. To understand what we're about to witness, you need to forget almost everything modern life has taught you about what slavery is supposed to look like. Forget the image you might be carrying in your head right now. Roman slavery did not run on the idea that any one group of people was inherently inferior to another. It ran on something colder and in some ways more frightening: bad luck. A Roman slave could be Greek, Gallic, Egyptian, Syrian, German, or Roman-born. Skin color meant nothing to the system. What mattered was a single roll of history's dice. Were you on the losing side of a war, born to a mother who was already enslaved, sold by your own starving family, or simply unlucky enough to be kidnapped by pirates on a stretch of open sea? At the height of the Roman Empire, scholars estimate that slaves made up somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 people in Roman Italy itself, a staggering fraction of the population, woven so completely into daily life that a Roman senator could walk through his own city and pass dozens of enslaved people without a second glance, because to him they were simply part of the architecture of normal life. They built the roads he walked on. They cooked the food he ate. They raised his children, balanced his accounts, performed his surgery, and wrote the letters he signed his own name to. This is the first uncomfortable truth we have to sit with. Roman slavery was not hidden in the shadows. It was not a guilty secret kept in some distant corner of the empire. It was the engine room of the entire civilization, running in plain sight, in every kitchen, every farm, every government office, every grand house from Britain to Syria. And it began for almost everyone who lived it in the exact same way, with the sound of a hammer and the sound of their own price being called out loud. Let's follow one possible path into that world, not a single named individual from history, because the honest truth is that history rarely recorded the names of the enslaved with any care at all. That silence is itself part of the story. So instead, picture a composite built carefully from what archaeology, law, and the writings of Roman authors actually tell us about how this process worked. A war ends on a frontier somewhere. Gaul, perhaps, or the Balkans, or the hills above the Adriatic. The Roman army doesn't simply defeat an enemy, it processes one. Prisoners are bound in long chains and marched sometimes for hundreds of miles toward the nearest major port or city. Roman commanders understood something brutally practical. A defeated population wasn't simply removed as a threat, it was converted into capital. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul alone are estimated by ancient sources to have resulted in the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire tribes converted almost overnight from free people defending their homeland into merchandise walking to a market. That market might be the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea, which by the late Roman Republic had become one of the largest slave trading hubs in the entire Mediterranean world. Ancient writers describe a port so efficient at processing human cargo that tens of thousands of people could be bought and sold there in a single day. Imagine the sound of that place. Not silence, noise. The noise of an ordinary, bustling market, because that is exactly what it was built to feel like. Merchants calling out prices, the clink of coins, and somewhere underneath it all, the particular kind of quiet that comes from human beings who have learned very quickly that crying out changes nothing. Buyers inspected people the way they inspected livestock. Roman sources describe slaves for sale being stripped, displayed, and examined, teeth checked, limbs tested, posture corrected by a tap of a rod, exactly the way a farmer might examine a horse before deciding whether it was worth the asking price. Some sellers hung a small plaque around a slave's neck, listing their origin, their skills, and any known defects or health issues, because Roman law actually required sellers to disclose this information or risk the sale being legally challenged later. There was, in other words, a kind of brutal bureaucratic precision to the whole event. Paperwork, guarantees, legal recourse for the buyer, and almost none whatsoever for the human being bought. And here is where Roman law draws the line that defines everything else that follows. Under Roman legal categories, a slave was considered not a persona, a person at all. A slave was res, a thing, a piece of property, legally grouped in the same broad category as a house, a cart, or a plot of land. This wasn't an insult or a figure of speech. It was the literal, formal language of Roman law, codified as far back as the 12 Tables in the 5th century BCE and reinforced for the next 1,000 years of Roman legal tradition. A slave could be bought, sold, rented, mortgaged, willed to an heir, or used as collateral on a debt in exactly the same legal sense as any other piece of property a Roman citizen might own. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it's easy to hear the legal term and let it slide past you without feeling its full weight. It means a person's name, their family, their entire identity before that day at the market simply ceased to have legal existence the moment the hammer fell and the sale was final. From that point forward, the law of Rome did not recognize them as someone capable of owning anything, marrying anyone, or even fully existing as a legal self. They could be physically present in the middle of the largest, most sophisticated legal system the ancient world had ever built, and be entirely invisible to it as an object someone else owned. This is the foundation everything else in this story rests. Not cruelty for its own sake, though there was plenty of it, and we will not look away from it, but something colder, and in some ways more disturbing. An entire civilization that built careful, detailed, intelligent laws around the idea that some human beings simply weren't legal human beings at all.
Historians studying Roman slavery have long pointed to a critical divide that decided, almost more than anything else, what kind of life or death awaited a newly purchased slave. Romans themselves had names for these categories. There was the familia urbana, the urban household slaves, and the familia rustica, the rural agricultural slaves. And the gap between these two worlds could be the difference between a hard, controlled, but survivable existence and something closer to a slow-motion death sentence. Let's start with the version that, on the surface, looked almost survivable. Picture a wealthy Roman household in the city, a domus with an open central courtyard, painted walls, a small fountain. A slave purchased to work inside this house might become a cook, a hairdresser, a household accountant, a tutor for the family's children, or a personal secretary managing correspondence and scheduling. Some urban slaves received genuine education, reading, writing, sometimes Greek philosophy or rhetoric, not out of kindness, because an educated slave was simply worth more money and could perform more valuable work. The Roman writer and statesman Cicero relied heavily on a man named Tiro, his personal secretary, who is credited by later tradition with developing an early shorthand system used to take down speeches and letters at speed. Tiro wasn't simply a servant, he was, in every meaningful intellectual sense, a collaborator, and yet, under Roman law, for years, he remained property. This is one of the strange, unsettling truths a documentary about Roman slavery has to sit inside, rather than simplify away. Some enslaved people in wealthy Roman households lived materially better lives than most free, poor Roman citizens. They ate better, they slept indoors, they were rarely starved because a starving slave performs poorly, and poor performance was bad for the household's bottom line. But material comfort is not the same as freedom, and we have to be very careful here not to let comfort be mistaken for safety. Because a household slave's entire existence, every meal, every roof over their head, every moment of physical safety, depended completely on the temperament of one single human being who owned them, a kind master or a cruel one, a patient master or one prone to violent rage. There was no system of law standing between a household slave and whatever mood their owner happened to wake up in that day, and that single fact made even the most comfortable household slavery a form of permanent, total vulnerability. Now picture the other world entirely. Roman agricultural estates, especially the enormous farming operations called latifundia that spread across Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, ran on a completely different economic logic, and it was a far darker one. Roman writer Cato the Elder, in his surviving agricultural treatise, advised estate owners on how to manage their rural slave workforce with the same cold calculation a modern accountant might apply to industrial equipment. Feed them enough to keep them working, no more. Sell off the old, the sick, and the unproductive rather than continue feeding a worker who no longer generates value. Cato's advice wasn't considered shocking or cruel by Roman standards of his time. It was considered practical. That, perhaps more than any single act of violence, tells you everything about the moral architecture of this system. On these rural estates, slaves frequently worked the fields in chained gangs, were housed at night in cramped barracks called ergastula, essentially rural slave prisons, some of them built partially underground, and were managed by overseers whose entire job performance was measured by how much labor they could extract. Mortality on the worst of these agricultural and mining operations was severe. Roman silver mines in Spain, for example, are described by later writers as so brutal that working in them was effectively understood by everyone involved as a slow sentence of death. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described enslaved mine workers as laboring in darkness underground for impossibly long shifts, their bodies breaking down under conditions that offered almost no realistic path to survival into old age. So when we say slave in the context of Rome, we have to immediately ask, which Rome? The household slave teaching a senator's children Greek grammar, who might one day be freed and become a Roman citizen himself, or the nameless figure in a Spanish mine shaft, whose entire existence might be reduced to a few brutal years of darkness before being replaced by the next body the market could supply. Both of these people were, under Roman law, the exact same legal category, res, property. And that single legal fact is precisely what allowed the system to treat both of their lives as fundamentally interchangeable, no matter how different their daily realities actually were. Rome was, for most of its history, deeply, persistently afraid of its own enslaved population, and for good reason. A society where 1 in 5 or even 1 in 3 people might be enslaved is a society sitting on top of an enormous amount of suppressed human will. The Romans themselves coined a phrase for this anxiety, quot servi, tot estes, as many slaves as enemies. It wasn't a throwaway line, it was a genuine, recurring fear that shows up again and again in Roman political and legal thought. And every so often, that fear became reality. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus, along with a small group of fellow gladiators, escaped from a training school in Capua. What started as a desperate breakout of a few dozen armed men grew within months into a movement involving tens of thousands of enslaved and free people across southern Italy. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus and his forces inflicted serious, repeated defeats on Roman military units sent to crush them, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a state that prided itself on the discipline and dominance of its legions. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Appian describe a conflict that genuinely terrified Rome's political class, not just because of the military losses, but because of what it represented: undeniable, organized proof that the enslaved population Rome relied on for its entire economy had never actually consented to the role it had been forced into. The rebellion was eventually crushed, as Rome's rebellions against slavery always eventually were. The Roman general Crassus defeated Spartacus's forces in 71 BCE, and ancient sources describe the survivors being subjected to mass crucifixion along the Appian Way, the major road leading into Rome itself, as a calculated public message. Thousands of crosses lining one of the most heavily traveled roads in the empire, visible to every traveler entering the capital. This wasn't simply punishment, it was architecture. It was Rome rebuilding the psychological walls of the system in the most brutal, visible way it knew how, ensuring that every single person who saw that road understood exactly what defiance would cost. And yet, here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The fact that Rome needed to respond with that level of public theatrical violence tells us something the system desperately did not want anyone to notice. You don't need to crucify thousands of people along your most important road if your enslaved population is actually content, actually convinced of its own designated place in the world. You only do that if you're terrified. Terrified that the lie at the center of your entire economy is closer to collapsing than you can afford to admit, even to yourself. This is the quiet tension running underneath the entire surface of Roman civilization. A society that needed slavery to function and simultaneously permanently afraid of the very people it depended on.
Here's something that often surprises people encountering Roman slavery for the first time, because it has no real parallel in the more familiar history of slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. Rome built an actual legal pathway, formalized in law, by which a slave could become free, a process called manumission. And astonishingly, freed slaves, called liberti or freedmen, didn't just gain personal liberty. In many cases, they gained full or partial Roman citizenship, something almost unimaginable in many other slave-owning societies across history. Why would Rome build this door into its own system at all? The honest answer is not romantic. It wasn't built primarily out of moral conviction. It was built because the promise of eventual freedom functioned as an extraordinarily effective tool of control. A slave who believed that years of loyal, productive service might eventually earn their freedom had a powerful incentive to work hard, avoid rebellion, and remain loyal to their owner specifically, rather than to the broader enslaved population around them. Manumission wasn't a crack in the system. In many ways, it was one of the most ingenious load-bearing walls holding the entire structure up. And the path itself was narrow, uncertain, and entirely dependent on the goodwill or self-interest of the owner. A slave might save small amounts of money, called a peculium, that their owner allowed them to keep, slowly accumulating enough to eventually buy their own freedom outright. An owner might free a slave in their will as a final act, sometimes for genuine attachment, sometimes simply to look generous in the eyes of Roman society after death. A master might free a slave as a public performance of status, demonstrating to other elite Romans that he was wealthy and benevolent enough to be generous with what he owned. But even freedom, once granted, carried lasting marks. A freedman in Rome carried social and legal restrictions that distinguished him for the rest of his life from someone born free. He typically owed continuing obligations of service and loyalty to his former master, now called his patron. He could not normally hold the highest political offices in Rome himself, though remarkably, his own children, born after manumission, often could, fully free citizens, carrying none of their parents' former legal stain. Funerary inscriptions found across the Roman world, carved by freedmen and their families, often proudly display their hard-won status, sometimes listing their former owner's name directly alongside their own, almost as a badge, a strange, layered kind of pride built on top of what had once been total ownership. This is one of the most genuinely complicated threads in this entire story, and we shouldn't simplify it just to make it feel cleaner. Manumission was real freedom, and at the same time, it was a system carefully engineered by enslavers to keep the machine of slavery running smoothly for everyone who remained inside it. Hope in Roman slavery wasn't simply the opposite of control. Very often, hope was control's most effective and most subtle tool. So far, we've followed the architecture of the system, the law, the labor, the rare door marked freedom. But underneath all of that architecture were individual human beings living inside bodies that could be legally hurt, legally violated, legally killed, almost without consequence for the person doing the harm. And it's here, in the most uncomfortable part of this story, that we have to look directly at what total ownership of another human being actually permitted. Under Roman law for most of the Republic and early Empire, an owner held what legal historians describe as something close to absolute power over an enslaved person's body, including, in principle, the power of life and death. This wasn't a rare or hidden possibility buried deep in obscure legal texts. It was a widely understood foundational fact of the entire system. Physical punishment was constant and largely unregulated for most of Roman history. Whips, branding, and various devices of restraint and humiliation were ordinary instruments of household management. Roman comedic plays, meant for entertainment, meant to be funny, repeatedly used the threat of brutal slave beatings as a casual punchline, which tells us something deeply unsettling. This violence wasn't treated by Roman society as a dark secret to be hidden away. It was treated as background noise, ordinary enough to be folded into comedy without anyone in the audience flinching. Sexual exploitation, too, was a routine, legally permitted feature of the system, particularly for enslaved women, though enslaved men and children were not exempt from it either. Roman law granted owners essentially unrestricted sexual access to slaves they owned, with no meaningful legal concept of consent applying to a person legally categorized as property in the first place. This is without question one of the darkest and most difficult truths in this entire history, and any honest documentary has an obligation not to soften it into vague language. It happened constantly, it was legal, and it left no meaningful path to justice for the people who endured it. And yet, slowly, unevenly, and never completely, something does begin to shift over the centuries of Roman history, and it's worth pausing on this shift carefully, because it complicates any simple story we might want to tell. By the early Roman Empire, a handful of legal reforms begin appearing that, for the first time, place some limits, however thin, on an owner's absolute power.
In 61 CE, the Emperor Nero issued what's known as the Lex Petronia, a law that removed an owner's unilateral right to condemn a slave to fight wild beasts in the arena without first obtaining approval from a magistrate. It's a narrow, specific reform, but its existence tells us something significant. The practice it restricted can clearly have been common enough and disturbing enough to require legal intervention at all. A few decades later, the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius and earlier emperors like Claudius and Hadrian introduced further limited protections, restricting an owner's right to simply kill a slave outright without cause, and in Claudius's case, ruling that a sick or injured slave abandoned by their owner to die would, if they survived, become legally free. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, writing letters to his friend Lucilius in the 1st century CE, went further than the law itself dared to go, arguing that slaves were, in their essential nature, the same as free men, separated only by the unfairness of fortune, and urging Roman owners to treat the enslaved people in their own household with basic human decency, even friendship. Seneca's own household, by his own account, owned slaves throughout his life. He was not calling for the end of the system. He was calling for kindness within it. And that contradiction, a brilliant philosophical mind capable of recognizing a slave's full humanity in one paragraph, while continuing to own human beings in the very next paragraph, might be the single most revealing detail in this entire documentary. It shows us that Roman society was fully capable of seeing the moral problem at the center of its own civilization. It simply was not willing, as a whole, to give up what that problem provided.